The first time Karen banged on our cabin door, it wasn't the kind of polite knock you'd expect from a new neighbor trying to welcome someone. No, this was the type of pounding you'd expect if someone was trying to break down the door or serving a search warrant. It shook the walls, made the picture frames rattle, and made both me and my wife jump. We had only been in the house for 3 days, still living out of boxes, still trying to figure out where the coffee filters were. We wanted peace, quiet, and a clean break from the noise of city life. But peace, I learned quickly, doesn't always exist where there's someone like Karen around. My wife was setting up the living room shelves, humming under her breath, while I tried to assemble the outdoor grill. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery, maybe something we ordered had arrived, though we hadn't given out our address to anyone yet. My wife looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I laughed nervously. "Pretty sure the whole county hears that." The pounding didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. Then came the yelling. "I know you're in there. Don't pretend you're not. You can't just move into this neighborhood without approval." Her voice was sharp, like nails on a chalkboard, cutting through the quiet air of our little street. My wife froze for a second, then shook her head. "Do we even know her?" she whispered. I shrugged. We hadn't met anyone yet. The moving truck had just pulled out 2 days earlier, and we hadn't even gotten around to walking the block. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't coming across as neighborly. "Ignore her," I muttered. "She'll get bored and leave." But Karen didn't believe in leaving. She started pacing, her shoes crunching against the gravel driveway, muttering about rules, regulations, and something about the HOA. My wife rolled her eyes. "An HOA? We didn't buy into an HOA neighborhood, right?" "Nope," I assured her. "This place is county land. No HOA within miles." That should have been the end of it, but Karen clearly didn't get the memo. She stormed back up to the porch, slammed her fist against the door again, and shouted, "If you don't open up right now, I'll call the cops. You can't ignore me." I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity. She's threatening us with the police, for ignoring the door. My wife smirked, shaking her head. "I've seen a lot in my life, but this is new." And then she turned back to the boxes like it wasn't worth her energy. That decision, to not even give Karen the time of day, was exactly what made Karen snap. Outside, I could hear the sound of her pulling out her phone, angrily punching numbers into it. "Fine. You leave me no choice. I'll call the authorities. Let's see how fast you open the door when you're in handcuffs." My wife stopped mid-step, glanced at me, and I could see the amusement flicker across her face. She didn't say much, just a quiet, almost mischievous, "Oh, she's about to regret this." At that moment, I wanted to burst out laughing. Here was this self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer, trying to call in the police over a door not being answered, unaware that the very person she was trying to report was, in fact, the new police chief of the county. My wife had only been sworn in a week earlier. Her official start date wasn't even until Monday. We had moved here in part to give her a closer commute, and to finally enjoy the home we'd dreamed about for years. And now here was Karen, about to embarrass herself beyond belief. I decided not to tell her yet. I wanted to see how far Karen would take this. I peeked through the curtain just slightly. Karen was pacing back and forth like she was waiting for backup, phone pressed to her ear, talking animatedly. Her arms flailed as she spoke, and at one point she even stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. My wife sat back on the couch, arms crossed, just watching me try to stifle my grin. "What do you think she told them?" she asked. "Probably that we're dangerous criminals who had the audacity not to bow down to the great Karen," I replied, and we both laughed quietly. But behind the humor, there was an edge. Karen's energy wasn't just annoying, it was invasive. We hadn't even had time to meet the neighborhood on our own terms before she started trying to control us. I thought back to all the stories I'd heard about people who moved to quiet communities only to find themselves trapped under the thumb of self-declared HOA dictators. At that moment, I realized, we were living one of those stories. Except this one was about to flip in a way Karen couldn't possibly predict. The sirens didn't take long. Within minutes, the faint wail carried across the lake, growing louder until the lights flashed at the end of our driveway. Karen was there, waiting for them like a stage actress finally ready for her spotlight. She waved both arms dramatically, pointing toward our house like she was revealing a villain's lair. I couldn't hear her words from inside, but her animated gestures told me enough. She was spinning her version of the truth. My wife stayed calm. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply stood, stretched her arms, and looked at me with that steady expression she always had. "Time to go meet my officers," she said softly. And with that, she walked to the door. Karen thought she had the upper hand. She thought she was about to humiliate the new neighbors, maybe even scare us into submission. But what she didn't know, what made this whole thing deliciously ironic, was that the woman she was trying to get arrested was the one person in this county who outranked every single cop she had just called. My wife wasn't just another neighbor. She was the chief. And Karen was seconds away from finding out just how badly she had messed up. The sirens grew louder until the familiar flashing lights lit up the front of our cabin like a stage. Karen, standing at the end of the driveway, puffed herself up like she was the hero of the story. She waved both arms frantically, as if the officers might somehow miss her if she didn't act like an air traffic controller. From inside, I could see her mouth moving rapidly, and I could almost hear the words spilling out of her mouth. She wasn't just reporting something, she was performing. My wife glanced at me, calm as ever, then turned the doorknob slowly. She wasn't rushing because she knew something Karen didn't. This wasn't a normal call for service. This was about to be the most embarrassing moment of Karen's self-proclaimed HOA career. The door creaked open, and the cool evening air drifted inside. I stepped out behind my wife but stayed a few feet back. This was her show now. Karen immediately pointed a shaking finger in our direction. "That's them. That's the couple. They're ignoring official HOA orders, refusing inspection, and violating the neighborhood's residency policy." She looked triumphant, like she had just delivered a criminal to justice. The two young officers exchanged glances. One was clearly new, his uniform crisp, his notepad ready. The other looked like he'd been on the job for a while, his expression tired, his body language cautious. "Ma'am," the older officer said slowly, "what exactly is the emergency here?" Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, like she couldn't believe they weren't already dragging us away in handcuffs. "The emergency," she said, her voice rising in pitch, "is that these people have moved in without authorization from the HOA. They refused to answer the door when I came to do my inspection. That is a blatant violation, and I want them cited and removed immediately." The younger officer blinked, clearly confused. "Inspection?" he repeated. "Yes." Karen barked. "As head of the HOA board, it's my duty to keep order in this neighborhood. They think they can just ignore me. Well, not today. Do your job, officers." She crossed her arms and smirked, like the matter was already settled. My wife took a slow step forward. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a sharpness underneath that only I caught. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the officers directly. "May I ask what seems to be the problem?" The older officer started to explain, but Karen cut him off with a loud scoff. "The problem," she snapped, "is that these people don't respect authority. They won't comply. They think they're above the rules. And I'm telling you right now, I want them dealt with before this neighborhood falls apart." She was getting louder with each sentence, drawing the attention of a few curious neighbors peeking out from their porches and windows. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, he said cautiously, as far as I know, this part of the county doesn't have an HOA. Karen's head snapped toward him like he had just committed blasphemy. What? Of course it does. I've been running it for years. You think I don't know my own neighborhood? Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her frustration. The older officer sighed, clearly realizing what was happening. Ma'am, if this is about a private disagreement, this really isn't a police matter, but before he could finish, my wife reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her badge. She held it up high, letting the flashing patrol lights gleam across the polished surface. Officers, she said firmly, her voice carrying authority that instantly changed the air, you don't need to waste another word. This is my residence. Both officers immediately stiffened. The younger one's eyes widened as he read the badge. Chief, he said, his voice almost cracking. The older one straightened his posture and nodded. Chief. We didn't realize this was your home. Karen froze. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. She stared at the badge like it was a weapon, blinking rapidly as if trying to convince herself she wasn't seeing what she was seeing. See, Chief, she finally stuttered. What do you mean, Chief? My wife lowered the badge just slightly, still holding it steady. Her tone was calm but sharp enough to cut glass. I'm the new police chief of this county. Sworn in last week. And you just summoned 2 of my officers to my house because I didn't answer the door when you demanded it. The silence that followed was delicious. Even the crickets seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. The younger officer coughed awkwardly, trying to suppress a grin. The older one kept his face neutral, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. Karen, on the other hand, looked like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her. She started waving her hands nervously, fumbling for words. Oh. Oh, well, I didn't know. I thought. I was just trying to keep the community safe, she stammered, her usual confidence evaporating in the glow of my wife's badge. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You called officers away from real work, she said steadily, because you felt entitled to an inspection that doesn't exist. There is no HOA here. You don't get to make up rules and harass new residents. And you certainly don't get to abuse police resources for your personal vendetta. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I wasn't abusing anything, she tried. I was just enforcing the regulations you invented, my wife cut in. Her tone was flat, final, like a gavel slamming down in court. Karen glanced at the officers for backup, but neither moved to support her. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, the older one stood quietly, letting the moment hang. The neighbors watching from their porches were now whispering, some even chuckling. Karen's so-called authority was unraveling before everyone's eyes. For the first time since she stormed onto our property, she looked small. My wife took one last step forward, her presence commanding. Consider this your warning, she said. If you ever harass us again, or if you waste my department's resources on nonsense, you won't just be embarrassed. You'll be facing charges. The weight of her words hung heavy in the night air. Karen's face went pale, then bright red, then pale again. She fumbled with her sunglasses, pointless at night, then quickly shoved them back on her face like a shield. Without another word, she turned on her heel and practically sprinted back down the driveway, muttering to herself. The officers didn't stop her. They just exchanged looks, both trying hard not to laugh. The older officer gave my wife a respectful nod. We'll mark this as resolved, Chief, he said with the faintest grin. Enjoy your evening. My wife returned the nod, calm and steady. Thank you, officers. I'll see you at briefing Monday morning. Their patrol car pulled away, leaving the driveway quiet once again. Karen had vanished into the shadows, no doubt humiliated beyond belief. I turned to my wife, unable to hold back my laughter anymore. "You couldn't have planned that better if you tried," I said. She smirked, slipping her badge back into her pocket. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people don't need to be put in their place. They do it to themselves." And she was right. Karen had dug her own hole and then dove into it head first. Karen's retreat should have been the end of it, but people like her rarely accept defeat gracefully. That night, as the flashing lights disappeared down the road and silence returned to our little lakefront street, I thought we might finally get some peace. My wife leaned back against the porch rail, sipping the coffee she'd reheated just before stepping outside. She looked relaxed, almost amused. "That woman has no idea how much she embarrassed herself," she murmured. I chuckled, but deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to just let it go. People who thrive on control don't simply vanish after being put in their place. They come back, usually louder, usually angrier, and usually more desperate. And sure enough, I was right. The very next morning, I heard her voice again, this time not at our door, but drifting through the open window from across the street. Karen was talking to another neighbor, and she wasn't whispering. "They think they're special," she barked. "Just because she's got some fancy badge doesn't mean the rules don't apply. I've been running this neighborhood for years, and I'm not about to let some outsiders ruin it." I peeked outside to see her standing with her hands on her hips, sunglasses back in place, lecturing a poor man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The man nodded politely, clearly not agreeing but not daring to challenge her. My wife, still in her robe, smirked. "She's spinning her story," she said. "She's not embarrassed, she's rewriting the narrative." I sighed. "She's going to keep pushing until she gets what she wants, isn't she?" My wife nodded. "Yes. But the problem with people like her is they don't realize the more they push, the more they expose themselves." That afternoon, things escalated. Karen came strutting down our driveway again, holding a clipboard as if it were a weapon. She didn't knock this time, she shouted. "You need to come out here. I've written up your violation notice, and if you don't comply, I'll escalate this to county enforcement." I nearly choked on my sandwich. Violation notice? For what? My wife set her plate down and walked to the door with calm, deliberate steps. She opened it just wide enough to step outside, arms folded, expression unreadable. "Ma'am," she said coolly, "what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Karen waved the clipboard like it was holy scripture. "Your trash cans are not stored properly. Your curtains don't match the exterior color guidelines. And your husband was grilling without prior approval. These are clear HOA violations, and you'll be fined." I couldn't hold back a laugh. Curtains? Grilling? Was this woman serious? My wife raised an eyebrow. "Once again, there is no HOA here. These rules are meaningless. And if you continue to harass us with fake notices, we'll treat it as criminal harassment." Karen's face twisted with fury. "You think your badge makes you untouchable," she shrieked. "But I know people. I have connections. You can't just move in here and ignore me." My wife's tone sharpened just slightly. "No, ma'am. You can't move through life making up authority you don't have. And you certainly can't threaten a law enforcement officer in her own home." Neighbors had started to gather by now. Curious faces peeked from behind curtains, and a couple of people had even walked down the street, drawn by the commotion. Karen noticed the small crowd and raised her voice even louder, trying to turn it into a performance. "See? This is what happens when outsiders come in. They don't follow the rules. They don't respect the community. If we let them stay, soon this whole neighborhood will fall apart." But instead of cheers, Karen was met with silence. A few neighbors shook their heads. One older woman muttered, "There's no HOA, Karen. You've been saying this for years." Karen spun toward her, her face twisted with betrayal. Of course there is. I'm the president. I've been keeping this place together. The woman crossed her arms. No, you've been bullying people. There's a difference. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. She wasn't just being challenged by my wife anymore, she was being called out by her own neighbors. My wife didn't need to say much at that point. She just let Karen flail, let her words dig the hole deeper. If you think I'm making this up, Karen shouted, her voice cracking, then I'll show you the paperwork. I'll sue every single one of you who defies me. My wife finally stepped in, her voice calm but commanding. Karen, listen carefully. There are no bylaws. No registered HOA. No county recognition of your so-called authority. You've been playing pretend. And if you continue to issue fake citations, collect fake fines, or harass residents, you'll be facing fraud charges. Do you understand me? The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped quietly. Karen's face turned bright red. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to find words. For a moment, she looked small, almost pitiful, standing there with her useless clipboard. Then, in true Karen fashion, she tried one last desperate move. She turned back to my wife and hissed, "You may be the police chief now, but power doesn't last forever. I'll find a way to get rid of you." My wife leaned forward slightly, her tone icy. "And every threat you make is being noted. You want to challenge me? Do it the right way. Otherwise, this conversation is over." She turned and walked back inside without another glance, leaving Karen standing there alone, her supposed authority crumbling in front of everyone. Over the next week, Karen's downfall became the talk of the neighborhood. People shared the story at the local diner, at the gas station, at backyard barbecues. "Did you hear what happened to Karen?" they'd say, chuckling. "She called the cops on the new family, and it turns out the wife is the chief." Even those who had once been intimidated by her now laughed openly. The legend of Karen's humiliation spread faster than wildfire. She became a cautionary tale, a living joke. And every time she walked down the street, sunglasses hiding her eyes, you could feel the whispers following her. For me and my wife, it was liberating. We had expected resistance moving here, but we hadn't expected to make such a statement so quickly. My wife never bragged, never rubbed it in. She simply went about her business, setting up our home, attending her first official days as chief, and living her life as if Karen didn't exist. That was what made it sting Karen even more. She had been reduced to background noise, irrelevant in the very place she once pretended to control. And yet, I could still see it in her eyes when we passed her on the street. Karen wasn't done. People like her never are. But now she wasn't fighting with just any neighbor. She was fighting with the law itself. And every step she took only made her look more ridiculous. In trying to prove her power, she had destroyed it. And the neighborhood would never see her the same way again. After that day, the neighborhood was never quite the same, not for us and certainly not for Karen. What had started as a ridiculous standoff over a door knock had turned into the moment that shattered Karen's illusion of authority. But like I suspected, she wasn't going to vanish quietly. People like her don't know how to let go. They thrive on drama, on controlling others, on being the loudest voice in the room. And even though she'd been humiliated in front of neighbors and police officers alike, Karen still had sparks of defiance left smoldering inside her. The problem was, every time she tried to reignite that fire, it blew back in her face harder than before. The days that followed were almost comical. Karen would stomp around the neighborhood with her clipboard, muttering under her breath, trying to convince anyone who would listen that she was still the president of the HOA. But now, instead of nodding fearfully, neighbors laughed behind her back. Some ignored her completely. One guy even waved and shouted, "Hey Karen, where's your gavel?" before bursting out laughing as he drove off. She had gone from self-proclaimed queen of the block to the butt of everyone's jokes overnight. And she had no one to blame but herself. Meanwhile, my wife was settling into her new role as chief with calm authority. Her first few days were packed with meetings, planning sessions, and getting to know the team she would be leading. But every time she came home, she carried herself with that same steady confidence, the kind that made Karen's antics look even more childish in comparison. Neighbors began stopping by, not to complain, but to thank us. "We've been waiting years for someone to stand up to her," one woman told my wife. "She's been scaring people with this fake HOA nonsense forever. You're the first person who didn't back down." My wife smiled politely, never gloating, but I could see the pride in her eyes. It wasn't just about shutting Karen down. It was about restoring balance in a place that had been bullied for too long. But Karen couldn't resist one last desperate play. About a week later, she showed up at a neighborhood gathering, a casual barbecue hosted by the Johnsons down the street. Everyone was there, kids playing tag in the yard, adults chatting around the grill, music playing softly in the background. We went too, excited to finally meet people in a normal, friendly setting. For the first hour, everything was peaceful. Then Karen arrived. She strutted in like she was walking onto a stage, wearing a sun hat far too large for her head and clutching a folder stuffed with papers. Conversations grew quieter as she approached the group, the mood shifting instantly. "Attention, everyone," she announced dramatically, waving the folder in the air. "I have here the official documents proving the legitimacy of this HOA, and I will not stand for this slander any longer." A groan rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh no, here we go again." Karen plopped the folder onto the picnic table, scattering napkins and paper plates. "These are the rules you all agreed to when you bought your homes. You are legally bound to follow them, and I will enforce them whether you like it or not." My wife set down her drink and calmly walked over. She didn't snatch the folder or raise her voice, she simply opened it, flipped through a few pages, and then held one up. "This," she said, her tone carrying across the yard, "is a list of made-up rules typed on your home printer. There's no county seal, no registration, no signatures from any governing body. This isn't an HOA. This is a fantasy." Karen flushed crimson. "That's not true. These are real documents." My wife raised an eyebrow. "Then explain why the bylaws are copied word for word from a template you downloaded online. Explain why none of these were filed with the county clerk. Explain why, when I ran your so-called organization through our records, it didn't exist." Gasps and murmurs filled the yard. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. Neighbors leaned in, finally emboldened to speak. "She tried to fine me for painting my shutters," one man admitted. "Told me she'd put a lien on my house if I didn't pay." Another woman shook her head. "She charged me $100 for parking my car in my own driveway. I thought it was real, so I paid her." My wife's jaw tightened, and she looked back at Karen with cold steel in her eyes. "So not only have you been harassing people, you've been taking money under false pretenses. That's fraud, Karen. And if you think for 1 second I won't take action, think again." Karen's sun hat slipped sideways as she sputtered. "And no, it was just community upkeep fees. That's all." I didn't mean, but her words were drowned out by the wave of anger spreading through the crowd. Neighbors who had once been quiet were now confronting her, voices overlapping, frustrations pouring out. Years of bottled resentment came crashing down all at once. And for the first time, Karen didn't have the power. She had no allies, no one backing her up. She was exposed, cornered, and utterly humiliated. She tried to storm off, but my wife stopped her with one final statement, delivered calmly yet firmly. "You wanted to act like the law, Karen. Well, the law is standing right here. And if you don't stop this nonsense, you won't just lose fake power, you'll be facing real consequences." Karen froze, then yanked her hat down to cover her face. Without another word, she fled the barbecue, her precious folder clutched against her chest like a shield. The crowd erupted in relief and even a few cheers. People turned to my wife, thanking her, some even shaking her hand. "You don't know what this means to us," one neighbor said. "She's been making our lives miserable for years. You just freed us." My wife smiled humbly. "I didn't free anyone," she said. "You were always free. You just needed to remember it." From that day on, Karen disappeared into the background. She stopped knocking on doors, stopped handing out fake notices, stopped shouting about rules. Occasionally, we'd see her out on a walk, sunglasses covering her face, head down, moving quickly to avoid conversation. Her reign was over, and she knew it. The power she thought she had was gone, not because my wife flexed her badge, but because Karen exposed herself as a fraud in front of everyone. For us, life settled into exactly what we'd hoped for when we bought the cabin. Peaceful mornings by the lake. Quiet evenings on the porch. Real friendships with neighbors who now greeted us warmly, not with suspicion. And every once in a while, when my wife and I were sipping coffee together, one of us would bring it up, and we'd both laugh. "Remember when Karen called the cops because you didn't answer the door?" I'd say. My wife would shake her head, smiling. She thought she was summoning the cavalry. Turns out, she summoned the chief. And that was the irony of it all. Karen had tried to weaponize authority to control others, but she ended up colliding headfirst with the very definition of authority. In the end, her meltdown wasn't just a personal failure, it was a lesson for everyone watching. Pretend power crumbles the moment it's confronted with real power. And for Karen, that realization didn't just sting. It ended her reign forever.